I'm attorney Phil Jusino, and this is the Phil Jusino Show. My special guest tonight is the Suffolk County Family Court Judge Frank Tantone. Good evening, Your Honor.
Good evening.
Judge Tantone sits over in Central Islip, New York. Suffolk County is somewhat unique in that we have family court in two locations. One is in Riverhead, and one is in Central Islip. It may be the only family county court that I'm aware of. And before we get into a little bit about jurisdiction and all those, I just want to ask Judge Tantone, when you graduated law school, obviously you became an attorney, did you see yourself pursuing a career as a judge?
Not really, actually. So a little bit of background. I graduated Notre Dame Law School and went into private practice at a firm over in Hauppauge. We both have a mutual friend,
Yes.
Judge
Judge Gargiulo.
Gargiulo,
Hmm.
and he had several other partners, Charlie Russo, who you may know,
I do.
another prominent attorney here in Suffolk County. I was there for about 6 years or so, maybe. Then my future partner and I both left and worked at General Accident Insurance.
Okay.
We were there for about 10 years. I got a great deal of litigation experience there. And then in 2000, my former partner, Anthony Galata, who unfortunately has now passed away, he and I started our own practice, and we were there up until the point I became a judge. Um, the reason I said I didn't initially think about I was going to be a judge, I had the opportunity a few times. I've always been very politically active. At one point, I was the Islip Town Republican leader for
Yes.
probably 8 years. And even during that time, I didn't envision myself as a judge.
You like being a judge, right?
I do. I do.
Okay.
Uh,
Now, compare and contrast that to an attorney.
uh, you know, I may be one of the few judges who liked being an attorney. I enjoyed the practice of law. We had a pretty decent practice. We did okay, did well. We did mostly personal injury work, so you got to litigate sometimes. But we did a lot of real estate work, much as yourself,
Sure.
more of a general practice. And just having people, want your help and need your help, it was very rewarding in a lot of ways.
When I think of that, because people have asked me if I ever want to become a judge, I always say I like being an attorney because I like fighting for the client. As a judge, you got the you have to make a decision.
Correct.
I don't have to make a decision. I
Correct.
fight, I go in the ring, I fight for my client, I present the best case possible,
Right.
and then the man or the woman in the black robe
Mm.
have to make the decision.
That's a very good point as to the difference, right? So we spend most of our careers advocating for
Right.
people, much like yourself. We do it very zealously. We represent our clients hard, right?
Sure.
We do the best we possibly can. But when you become a judge, that's all done. You have to be as neutral as possible at that
Right.
point. But as you say, the other part of being a judge is you need to make a decision at some point.
You do.
And sometimes that's not. Sometimes that for some judges that takes
Right.
some getting used to.
And I always try, even politically, or I always try to look at both sides
Hmm.
and not jump to conclusions
Hmm.
until the evidence comes in or the facts comes in, and you do it well. Some judges do it better than others, just like some attorneys get it better than others.
Yeah.
But um, do you sometimes find it hard when, let's say, a case appears before you? You
Hmm.
read the petition,
Hmm.
you have an idea what it's about, but you don't have all the facts.
Right.
And what do you do to try to maintain your impartiality until you hear all the evidence? Because sometimes we jump to conclusions.
Yeah, I mean that is actually the biggest hurdle that you have to get over initially when a case comes in. You have to just keep an open mind until you've heard both sides,
Right.
because as you know, in family court, we get people who come in often without representation, and sometimes they may have the best. As I say to people often, you may have the best case in the world, but if you can't tell the story
Right,
well enough,
right.
it's a problem. Many times in family court, we have clients, or we have litigants, I should say, who are appointed attorneys. There's a program by which people can be found eligible, and they need that attorney to tell their story better, so that if they do have the right case that I
Right.
would find in their favor, it doesn't get lost in the wash, so to
And
speak.
and God forbid if the case goes to trial, they don't know how to get evidence in,
That's
and you
true.
can't help them
No, I
as a judge. You can't say,
right.
"Well, you missed the question." You might just say, "No, I'm not allowing that in. You haven't laid the foundation." And it's frustrating. I've seen it
Yes,
where I've
yes,
seen it when some attorneys don't know that extra question.
yes,
But for a pro se litigant, and you said it yourself, they may have the stronger case, but if they can't present it, what are
Yeah.
you supposed to do?
You hit that right on the head. So when we do have cases in my courtroom where sometimes people just refuse to have a lawyer.
I know.
They just
I've
say,
seen that.
I'm not doing it.
Uh,
And we say to them, we'll give you one. The county will supply you one free of charge. No, I don't want it. But that was a very good point that you made. My standard speech, if you will, right, is that I can't bend the rules of evidence. There are certain rules of evidence where I'm allowed to hear or consider certain things. But if they can't tell their story properly, I'm not allowed to take that
no,
evidence into consideration.
you're not.
So that gets me to my speech about when you may have the best story, but if you can't tell it, it's a problem.
Remember Referee Burke some years
Yes,
ago? Okay.
yes,
Well, he was always, where's the Article 8? He did a lot of orders of protection.
yes,
And his standard speech was, sir, let's say someone said, I don't need a lawyer.
right,
Sir, where did you go to law school? And the person would, I didn't go to law school.
right.
Okay. Well, how many years have you been practicing? Or how many years have you been studying the law?
Mm-hmm.
Well, what do you do, sir? Well, I'm a plumber, I'm an electrician,
Right.
whatever. Do you know how to get a document and evidence? And then the person will be like, I think you're right.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
I think I better come back or at least consult with an attorney.
Right.
See, now, as a judge in a family court, let's talk a little bit about jurisdiction.
Sure.
I said before, you can't get a divorce in family courts. Some people
No.
come in and I say to them, sometimes I say, what's the most important issue? My kids. And let's say they don't have a lot of money. I said, well, maybe put the divorce on the back burner and file a petition for custody.
Mhm.
So what kind of cases, as a judge, are you able to hear sitting as a judge in family court?
Okay, so the Family Court Act authorizes us to hear, as you said, custody and visitation matters. We have what's called concurrent jurisdiction with the Supreme Court, meaning that either Supreme or family can hear custody and visitation matters. Sometimes that is inclusive in the divorce, which means it's over in Supreme, or some people, like you say, will choose to come straight to family court and resolve their differences with us. We also have jurisdiction over orders of protection, where one party feels that they need to be protected from someone else's behavior in certain ways, and there are criteria by which we have to grant those or not grant those applications. And then the larger part, or maybe the same size of our caseload with custody visitation, is we have jurisdiction over child neglect and abuse cases, and that's pretty. And then we do a little bit of enforcement of non-payment of.
Right. So, and I always say the support magistrate can't sentence somebody to jail,
Correct.
but they can recommend it,
Yes.
and then they go before a judge like yourself,
Yes.
who has to hear it and set a purge amount and maybe make a decision whether or not that person goes to jail.
Correct. So when someone unfortunately or for whatever reason falls behind in their child support payments, obviously the children are suffering at that point because they need to have that support in many instances. So the magistrate might refer the case to a judge who would then have the authority. We can sentence somebody up to 6 months in jail. We try not to do that at all costs. We try to
see that.
obviously sending the person to jail doesn't get the child the money. So we try to see if we can work out some sort of a payment schedule or some way to get the money.
Quick funny story. I had a case in Riverhead years ago. The guy swore up and down he didn't have the money.
Mm.
The ex said, he's got it. Once you put those handcuffs on him, he's going to pay. And in the back of the courtroom was his mother and a girlfriend. And I said to the judge, he doesn't have the money. Doesn't have it. And this is so long ago, I think Judge Snellenberg.
Wow. Yeah,
We're
that's
talking
going
years
back.
and years ago.
Yeah.
And the judge says, no, he's going to jail. They put the cuffs on him. He looks back and he says, Mom, make the payment. I think he was talking about 50 grand.
Yeah.
You know what Judge Snellenberg did? Says, no. They want to bail you out or make the
Right.
purge amount. They're going to go over there and wait in Riverhead Court, where you're going to be going, Riverhead Jail rather,
Yeah.
where you're going to be going shortly.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, and you don't always know, that sometimes putting a person in cuffs, let's say, and they're about to go to jail, all of a sudden money frees up from
Oh
someplace.
yeah, sure. I've had
You've seen that.
I've had the situation like you said. By the time the van got the person out to Riverhead, mysteriously the money
Somebody-
was there before he was.
Somebody
she?
was right. Somebody was there.
Right.
Now, what kind? We were talking a little bit about it before.
Yeah.
You were saying all the different types of cases
Sure.
you were able to handle. What kind of attorneys? So we have private attorneys. We have, you said 18B or legal aid. Those are the court
Correct.
appointed.
Right.
Now, just to be clear, because some people always ask me this question, what's the difference? Well, if you can't have legal aid, representing two parts of the same case, let's say.
That's correct.
So that would be, let's say, an 18B, which would be a private attorney that happens to be on a panel.
Right. So we have two panels in family court. One is a panel. One of the unique things that we didn't touch on in family court is there's actually a third party litigant in most family court cases, and that's the child or children. So there's a division of the Legal Aid Society, which is the Children's Law Bureau, which is routinely assigned to represent the children in these matters, either in custody cases or in neglect cases. And the reason that is because for two reasons, as I always tell people in my courtroom. Number one, the children's interests are not necessarily the same as either
Right.
mom or dad, so the children get their own representation. But in cases, for instance, well, even in custody cases, but more often in neglect cases, the judge needs an unbiased opinion of the facts of what's going on
Sure.
with this child back in the house. So those are the two reasons why children are supplied their own attorney, and that's always free of charge.
Right.
So that's usually the Children's Law Bureau, but as you say, they're also part of legal aid. So you can't have legal aid on
Correct.
two different parties in the case, and that's why we have a panel of attorneys like yourself in private practice who are eligible. They have to make an application to be attorneys for children, and then we have another
And attend
panel.
classes and
Right,
do all of that.
exactly, and keep up their continuing ed in that regard. And then we have a panel of what we call 18B. It's Section 18B of the specific law, which allows anybody to be appointed counsel if they're financially eligible.
Right. And now we call them AFCs, or attorneys for the children.
Yeah.
When I was on the panel, they were law guardians, and our roles
Yes.
were slightly different.
Yes,
Right? How we advocated for them and all that. And then also, assistant county attorneys go before you.
that's
And that would
correct.
be in neglect. So explain about that a little bit.
So on neglect cases, which include everything from, uh, you know, substance abuse cases where the parents are using substances in the presence of their children, or domestic violence cases which take place in the presence of the children, right up to the unfortunate sexual abuse cases that we all see too. So in family court, we don't prosecute those matters criminally. They can be prosecuted criminally, but that happens by the district attorney over in the criminal court. Our cases are simply just to determine whether the child's been neglected, and in the most severe cases, the parents' rights can be terminated and the children can be
Right.
removed.
And initially, the goal generally is reunification if
Correct.
if the kids are taken away.
Correct.
But a lot of that, the ball is in the court often of the parent. If they do what they're supposed to do, and I always tell them, you'll get your kid back if you do what you're supposed to do.
Right.
If you don't do what you're supposed to do, at some point, as you said, their rights can be terminated.
Yeah.
And it's a process. It's not right away,
No,
generally.
no, correct.
They may
Yeah,
lose the kid right away temporarily, but they'll always try to find like a grandparent or something like that.
that's correct. So initially, if the Department of Social Services detects that a child might be in danger, they'll come in and ask for an emergency removal of that child from the house.
Right.
But from that point forward, at least initially, the goal is always to try to reunite the family. That's part of the Family Court Act. Unfortunately, there are situations where children can't go back to that home, or they were sexually abused in some way, or the parents are just can't kick their drug habit, and eventually there's after quite a bit of time, months, 18 months, and sometimes longer, the county may then choose to file what's called a termination of parental rights. We can't give this child back; it's too dangerous, and we're going to have to unfortunately take the child.
Right. And the parent has a right to have their day in court. They
Oh
can
yeah,
have a hearing.
it's
No
a trial.
jury. You make that decision
That's correct.
after you hear the evidence.
That's
And
correct.
there's no jury in any family court case. In fact, in Supreme, you only saw them when you had a situation of grounds.
Right.
But only in like civil and criminal DC. It's a family court. That's another thing. If you were a criminal judge, you might decide on evidentiary rulings,
Mhm.
but the jury is going to make that decision.
Right.
You make that decision, and sometimes it's a tough decision and very important. Terminating someone's rights.
Yeah, I mean, we do that, and as you said, the judges make the decisions. We are also presented with more emergency situations than most other courts, right?
Yes.
So I think this is not something I'm particularly proud of, but I think I hold the record at this point. I once finished a hearing at 1:45 in the morning.
Oh my God. My latest was 10 o'clock.
Okay.
I think it was 10 o'clock. And I remember calling my wife and saying, I'm in court.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah,
it,
yeah.
it
Well,
can go away because
when
you're
it
taking
comes
a kid away.
right when the child is being removed, it's an emergency situation. It has to be done right then and there. DSS and CPS, Department of Social Services and Child Protection Services, they are equipped to literally take the child that evening and bring it to foster care, or take care of it overnight and then bring it to foster care. So you need to make that decision then and there.
Right.
In the case I spoke about, we probably started that hearing early, much earlier. I think it was probably a 5 hour hearing, and
You go to completion.
we had to finish it. It was
Mhm.
12:45 when we finished.
The best times in family court adoption.
Yes.
They used to do them all on Fridays. I don't know. Now we've had
Well,
them
we do
some.
them on different days, and I'll just put in a plug. We just did Adoption Day. I don't know if you were
Yes,
aware of that,
I am
right?
aware of that. I had one
So,
prior to that, but I
yeah.
did see that.
So we actually did something a little different this year. Judge Krecker, Judge Lagercio put together a very nice situation where we did it out at the Riverhead Aquarium.
Right.
And I was fortunate enough to have two that day. And Judge Hughes did two adoptions that day also. And then the kids were, permitted to go through the aquarium. It was a great
That's
day.
nice. Yeah, that's the one day where people are happy. Grandparents
Yes.
come in, balloons,
Yes.
stuffed animals, and you can take pictures with the judge,
Yes.
which you normally would not. You wouldn't want to
True.
do a picture. It's a custody case. You want to take a picture?
Yeah. Right.
But that's something that, in fact, my dad, who does a lot of my adoption paperwork,
Hmm.
he came in. It was Judge Gums. We had nice
Okay.
adoption,
Sure.
and we took a picture. My dad came in and took a picture with us.
Yeah. That's the nicest thing we do in family court. We all look forward to those. So
Right. Now, with regard, you get a lot of, in your part, a lot of custody cases, correct?
I do. I
Right.
do. Yeah.
And that's where you have a mother and a father. They could be married or not,
Or
either one.
not. Right.
And the best interest analysis.
Correct.
So it could mean different things to different people. And there's a
Hmm.
whole bunch of things, such as who's the primary caregiver. Are there any alcohol or drug issues? So when you're considering the best interest, what does that mean to you?
So we basically uh, rely on what the home situation is like. Sometimes the one parent is better equipped to have the child in the home. We have situations sometimes, unfortunately, when people are in shelters. That doesn't obviously mean that they can't have the child, but it's a factor. Um, Things like it can come down to things like who's in a school district that might benefit the child better, who's financially able to take care of the child, which is not all that theoretically not a big deal because the other party should be paying child support,
Right.
which we touched on, right? Um, Sometimes, as you've done, I'm sure we have situations where one party wants to relocate.
Oh, right.
They
Right.
want to take the child out of
Sure.
state. So
That
then,
complicates
right,
things.
that complicates things a lot because then you've got to come up with an acceptable visitation schedule for the non-custodial parent. And sometimes, and I've tried a number of those relocation cases over the years, and the party who wants to leave has to give me all the information of where they're
Sure.
going and what the school
And make
district
an
is like.
accommodation to make sure that
Correct.
other parent.
Right.
I remember one time I had to argue back to back at the appellate division. One time I was arguing for the relocation,
Mm-hmm.
not, and one of the judges said, "What were you here about a day or two ago?" And you were arguing the. I said, "But that case was different."
Right.
But
Right.
it complicates things because if a person is moving to Florida, let's say
Mm,
let's say it's the dad who's not having custody,
right.
he's not going to see his kid every other weekend. So
No.
you have to say, okay, you're going to get more of the summer,
Right.
or you're going to get more of the recesses, and it's not easy. And I always tell my clients, it's really got to be for financial reasons. You can't do it because you met somebody online and
Right.
you want to move to Vegas.
Right.
It's got to
Or
be, is the kid going to benefit? Can you make it? There's a whole
correct. There's a
litany
whole
of
there's
things.
the case on that is tropia, obviously, which spells
I
out
pronounce it Chapia, but same thing.
which spells out the
Sure.
criteria. But the other thing that we get also is we have parents who don't see their children often enough, and then the moment the other spouse wants to move to another
Right.
state, now all of a sudden they're parent
And
of
that's
the
a
year,
factor.
and that's a factor,
Right.
right?
So I always say, look, if you're father of the year, you got a better shot of blocking it than if you're a deadbeat dad.
Correct.
And somewhere in the middle are most people. But if you're going to try to stop it, do you see the kid? Yes, I see the kid all the time. Okay, that's a valid
Right.
reason. If
That
you haven't
is
seen the kid in 2 years, why are you coming now
right.
to put the kibosh on
Right.
that?
But those
on
are
that
all
move?
factors, as you said. Those are all things we have to consider before we make a
I
decision.
took a seminar recently, Matt Law. You heard of it, the Tippins,
Yeah.
and he was saying the trend has been more to put weight on, and this has always been to some extent the
Mhm.
case, that the custodial parent can make sure that the non-custodial parent can have a good relationship. In other words, fostering
Hmm.
a
Oh,
relationship. And I
sure.
tell my clients, if you don't do that, you may be the better parent, but if you don't foster a relationship, you could lose custody.
That's correct. That's also one of the factors. If you're going to take this child and go somewhere, or how do you intend for this child to continue a relationship
Right.
with the other parent?
Sure. And
That's
even if you don't go anywhere, are you going to make sure
yes,
that Junior sees dad or mom,
right.
whatever the case might
And
be?
unfortunately, as you know, because we've both been doing this a while now,
Right.
right? So we have parents that unfortunately try to alienate their children
That's
from the
big.
other side.
Right.
So then it gets even more complex at that point.
Right. And I always tell my colleagues, I said, I wish more judges would hold the other's feet to the fire,
Mm-hmm.
and somehow because
Hmm.
it's tough to say, all right, I'm going to change custody because what if you have a kid that clearly doesn't want to go to dad?
Right,
So you don't want to punish the kid for the mom's misdeeds,
right.
but you got to send a message somehow.
Hmm.
I remember I had a case. I won't say the judge, but he did the right thing, and he ended up putting it was egregious,
Right.
and there was tapes to prove that the mother didn't want the child to see dad, and dad was in law enforcement, and he put the mother in jail for the weekend.
Wow.
Right. And you don't see that too often,
No.
but I got to say this case, in a sense, warranted it
Hmm.
because what do you do then? You could say, all right, you're going to pay attorney's fees. What if the person doesn't have any money?
Right.
So the person keeps getting. I always say, if there's no consequences,
Right.
people will
Well,
continue to get away with that. Now, to go back for a second to the neglect, you had said after COVID you saw a lot more neglect cases and especially sex abuse
well,
cases.
it's been an odd trend. It's been an unexplained trend. Although some of it, we understand some of it. People were cooped up in their homes, and life was different, as we all
Right.
know, right?
Very.
So we did see a market increase in drug and alcohol related cases. Obviously, people being cooped up in their house. Domestic violence, unfortunately, went
Sure.
up too. But we've also seen an uptick. It's more than that. It's an increase in sexual abuse cases, which we don't have an explanation for, honestly. But
And that's
unfortunately,
very, very sad.
it's myself and Judge Lagarcio have had this discussion, and some of the other judges. It's a noticeable increase, which we can't really explain, unfortunately. Yet,
That's a tough one.
yeah,
Now, when the county is involved in those kinds of cases,
hmm,
they also have Department of Social Services because they always say our client. So
yes,
they have a lot of say. So it's not even the assistant county attorney making the call often; it's their client.
that's correct. So the assistant county attorney represents the Department of Social
Right.
Services. So as we know, practicing attorneys, client has the final say most times.
Mm.
You'll give them the advice, and they can choose to ignore your advice. Not saying that's what DSS does, but obviously the county attorney takes their instruction from their client.
Which is interesting because I was a former prosecutor
Mm,
and we controlled the case. Now we had supervisors, but we
sure,
controlled the case. Sometimes I'm talking to an assistant county attorney who might agree with how a case should go,
right.
but their client, they say, well, my client doesn't agree.
Well,
They have a lot of
that's
say.
actually it's actually getting better. I have to give them credit, right? So we have a roster of county attorneys now who uh, give their client the proper legal advice, and they're a bit firmer than they have
Okay,
been
that's
in the
good.
past. And likewise, the people on the other end are a bit more receptive to their advice. So we're working on it. It's
Right.
getting better.
And there are a lot of, you have Department of Social Services. Sometimes you have facilities where a kid may be housed or whatever.
Sure,
And so a lot of information is coming in that you have to process. So
correct.
it's not just one thing that you factor in.
Yeah, I think the situation you're talking about is, I mean, DSS has and CPS, they have the information, right? They have field investigators, they have caseworkers that
Mhm.
are out there trying to find everything out that they can about the particular case. I think where it sometimes gets a little, the wires get crossed, if you will, is that the the information that they have, they want the legal steps in a certain way or
Right.
in a certain order, and the attorneys say, well, those facts don't quite justify A, B, C, and that's where they may have a little bit of
Right. And also, people want to protect themselves. They don't want to say, here, give the kid back, and God forbid,
a right.
we've seen
Something
Alva
happens.
case, and
Yeah,
we've seen
yeah,
things like that, and then somebody is exposed.
right.
So sometimes they'd rather err on the side of caution but you still have to
You know,
think it through.
that's a good point, Phil, because those of us who do neglect cases, the tendency would be to err on the side of caution. You're absolutely right. On the other hand, you got to remember you're actually depriving a parent of being with their child.
Absolutely.
So if you're just
Sure.
it's really easy to just say, I'm going to take this kid and put it in foster care. That's going to be the safest thing for me. But you know what? One, it disrupts the child's life. The child may not want to go to foster care in a strange house with strange people
It's
initially.
not comfortable.
And then likewise, the parents have rights too. So it's not quite that easy. We don't want to just take kids away just to be safe.
No. Oh, I have a couple of comments. Somebody
Sure.
said, please say the judge's name. This is Judge Frank Tantone. He is a judge in the family court of Suffolk County. Uh, so somebody said, Phyllis Ann. Hi, I'm CPS. Somebody from
Okay.
CPS. Okay. Someone said, great show, and a whole bunch of people are watching. Someone says, I want to be, oh, Phyllis Ann, I want to be a guest on your show.
If it's the Phyllis I'm thinking of,
Yeah.
she'd be a great guest.
Yeah, we can. Now, how long you been a judge?
I am finishing my 7th year.
Okay, so family court for the my viewing audience, it's a 10-year term.
That's
I always
correct.
say Supreme Court is 14, District Court is 6. Your term is 10 years.
That's right.
So at the end of the 10 or close to the end, you can choose to seek reelection.
If I were to be reelected, it would be in 2026. Correct.
Okay. And sometimes judges retire, they go back into private practice, they seek higher court. So there's a whole bunch of different things judges
Sure.
have to consider. Burnout is, from what I've read, the highest for family court judges.
Yeah, I would say that would make sense to me. I mean, we have the most
Makes perfect sense, right?
intense
Sure.
practice, if you will. I mean, things happen every day, immediately. We need to make decisions now, not later.
It's not like a car accident case where you can adjourn it 6 weeks and see what happens.
Oh yeah, no,
Or even in
exactly.
a criminal case, you still have a little bit of leeway, if a person is in or they're out on bail. But you're right, family court, even every conference potentially, a decision has to be made as to how things are going to proceed.
Right. I mean, we're monitoring different facets of everybody's behavior every time they come into court, and things change. People, unfortunately, let's use the example: if you have an addiction problem, some people get better. They work on it.
Sure.
They get treatment and they kick their habits, so to speak. But that doesn't happen overnight.
No.
So we
and
have
there's
to
relapsing. People
correct. So
relapse, sadly.
unfortunately, sometimes relapse is part of it, right? But we have to keep monitoring that because, as we said at the very beginning, right, the goal is to return the child if we possibly can.
Possibly can. So if you were king for a day, and I'll give you my opinions, but
Yes. Yeah.
what would you like to see? What kind of improvements can, let's say, a family court make?
Well, I'll take it from the standpoint of a practitioner, which I was for many years before I got to the bench, right? I think we need to have more certainty. And there are days where sometimes attorneys sit in my courtroom all day.
Right.
I don't know how they could possibly run their practice that way.
It's tough.
It's difficult.
Especially someone like me who's charging, an hourly rate.
Well,
in most of my
right.
cases. How
So
do you justify it sometimes?
I think some of that is due to the fact we just need more attorneys. We have our 18B attorneys. We talked about that a little earlier, right? The panel has gotten to the point where it's gotten so small that they're very overburdened at this
Right.
point.
They may have 8 or 9 cases.
Right.
They're running around
Correct. And
trying to get them.
and that means that if you're waiting for so and so, you may wait in my courtroom because that person is in 5 other courtrooms.
Right. They're busy. They're not just playing games. But
Correct.
and the toughest thing I find, in my opinion, is the trials. Because if you can't locate that
Right.
other attorney who might be on another case, you can't get started.
Well, you see, family court is unique to me. Like my practice was pretty much Supreme Court practice when I was there, when I was in private practice, right? And family court, very rarely do you have a trial that goes day to day, meaning one day, and then if you don't finish, you go to the next day. It's probably the only court I've ever experienced in 35 years that works that way.
So believe it or not, divorce cases too. I had
Do they?
cases
Okay.
that spread out, but like when I love a jury trial in a criminal case
Oh, sure.
because you start and you finish,
Right.
and they bend over backwards for those jurors.
Right.
So they'll be like, "Get back here 2:15." But you're right. You could have a case that, let's say, 6 days spans 7 months.
Yes, I've had custody cases that went that
Right.
long because you do 2 hours here, 3 hours there. Now, one of the things that's just happened recently, which may have some uh, long-term effect and improve things. The panel attorneys were being grossly underpaid for the
Right.
longest time.
They bumped it up a bit.
Fortunately, Governor Hochul increased that rate recently, so hopefully we'll see more attorneys joining the panel.
Right. Well, I'll be honest with you. One of the reasons why I got off it at the time, I was with a firm,
Mm,
and I was just being, spread too thin,
sure.
and it was peanuts you were making.
Yes.
So it almost didn't pay
Yeah.
for
No,
me.
it didn't.
Right.
It didn't.
So unless you're doing real volume or something like that, it almost didn't pay.
I mean, even the rate that it's now been increased to is probably not enough, but
Not
it's
not even
better
close
than
to
it
what.
was.
Right.
Right.
And the other thing too is if you get a trial,
Hmm.
you're only making that rate, you could be there, as you know, you could be there all day.
Yes.
Look at you. You're saying a little while ago, one of your cases went to 1 in the morning or
Yeah.
thereabouts.
Right.
So if
Right.
that person's on panel rates,
Right. And you got to also take into account, like I'm sure you would have to, what are you missing back at your own office
right.
while you're sitting there waiting and waiting and waiting?
I
So,
would say if I could bottle the time I sit around,
mm,
I could take a sabbatical
mm,
because all
yeah,
that time you wait, and also a lot of times I'll end up not charging the client fully
right.
because I'm there. So I'll try to make other. There's not much you can do if you're
No,
waiting around to
right,
start a trial,
right,
right? How much work can you bring with you?
right.
But that's one of the things I would love to see improved,
Yeah,
so that you could start a trial when you're supposed to, even if you're not going to go full day. Like sometimes, let's say we're going to start at 11, right? And you get there, and the AFC is covering another case. Let's say you have a custody case, and a
mm,
neglect case takes priority.
mm-hmm,
So they
mm-hmm,
might be on that neglect case, and then the judge at some point, Your Honor, is going to say, "Look, just come back at 2:15,
right,
because what are
right,
we going to start at 12:30?"
right,
So that morning, I could have been a little more productive doing something else.
right. Well,
But
that's actually one of the practical problems that we have right now. So just so you may not know this, or the public may not know this, but we're actually going to get an additional family court judge.
mhm,
So if we have an extra judge, obviously
sure,
that's one more person to hear cases. That should alleviate some of the
that
caseload
would help.
stress.
Yeah,
The problem we have with that is a lot of the other organizations are not following suit. County attorney is on demand. The Children's Law Bureau is on
sure.
demand. The legal aid is on demand. So you're still waiting
Yeah.
unnecessarily because they can't fill their jobs
Mm.
quickly enough.
Someone had said, please ask the judge if he has access to cases decided to see how decisions work out. 1 year. Oh, I think I got it.
Okay.
1 year, 2 years done. So in other words, feedback as
After,
to,
yeah,
right.
sure.
You get that unless they
Uh,
come back in.
we do actually, and well, sometimes it's not.
Good question.
That is a good question, and sometimes the feedback is not great because, as you probably experienced too, Phil, you, people come back
They
over and
do.
over again. In
Repeat
family
business.
court, the Family Court Act actually has a provision: one family, one judge. So, in that vein, if the people come back to court to change their custody
Right.
agreement, or unfortunately, if it's a neglect and the person has a relapse, they come back to me.
That's not a bad thing.
It's not a bad thing because many times when I'm settling a case with you and your client, I'll say to the people, "And, you're telling me you're going to do ABC, and you better do it because if it doesn't happen, you're coming back to me,
Right.
and I'm going to know what the circumstances are," and that works sometimes. And I have had it's pleasant. It doesn't happen enough, unfortunately, where people will come back and say, Judge, I had this addiction problem or whatever. I was in the courthouse for something else or
Mhm.
whatever. I had to get a paper or something. I just wanted to stop it and let you know that everything worked out well. Blah blah blah. And I'm sure, and I know Judge Garcia's had that situation too.
Mhm.
That unfortunately doesn't happen as not as much as we'd like, but yes, we do get feedback.
Okay. And how was the decision made? Like you were saying, like Judge Camacho does a lot of JDs, juvenile delinquents.
Correct.
You get the overflow.
Right.
How was the decision made where like one judge might get a lot of custody cases, one judge might get neglect, one might get orders of protection?
So in every level of the courthouse, there's a supervising judge. All right, that's the person who is in charge of administerial
Right.
type things. It was Teresa Whalen, who we all remember.
Right.
Unfortunately,
Yes.
Teresa's not with us anymore, right? And now it's Karen Lagercio, who's
Mhm.
been there probably the longest of all of us. So Karen is there, and she's got the most experience of all of us. Um, when I started, Judge Whalen was the supervising judge. I did custody and visitation cases for a while. And then as I got more experience, I guess, or seniority, that's where they start to move you into neglect cases.
Do you get to lobby for the kinds of cases that you might want?
Yes. Yeah. Actually, I'll give you a great example, as you probably know, because you told me a story before we went on the air here. Judge Malone at one point decided that he was more comfortable and wanted to do orders of protection, and he went to Judge Lagarcio and sold her the idea, and he's doing mostly orders of protection.
It's funny you say orders of protection because the story I was telling you involved an order of protection. And
Hmm.
I'll tell it again. Uh, we had a self-represented litigant on the other side. I had a woman, and there was a guy on the other side, and he wasn't very happy to
Right.
be there, and he
Right.
was a little angry.
Mm.
And I went up to him before the case because he didn't have an attorney. He said he was going to get one. I couldn't talk to him. He
Right.
said, "I'm not
Right.
getting one." So
Right.
I said, "You want to chat?" He said, "No." So we go inside, and Judge Malone says, "Phil, what's going on?" I said, "Well, he won't talk to me." He says, "Sir, you're going to get an attorney?" He says, "No." He says, "Well, look, I suggest you go back out there and give it another shot
Mm.
to talk." So we
Mm.
go out there, and nothing was working. I was
Yeah.
being very nice.
Yeah.
I was trying to be charming
Yeah.
and very pleasant. And I know he hated my client, but I'm like, the guy standing before you is being very courteous. And at I either could have given up and said, "Judge, I tried."
Right.
So I just stuck my hand out, and I was in the middle of the waiting area there.
Yeah.
So it was kind of awkward if he didn't take my hand.
Right.
So I just stuck my hand out, and he looked at me like, "What does that mean?"
Mm.
So I said, "Shake my hand." He shook my hand, and while he held it, I said, "I'm being very respectful to you. All I ask is that you be respectful in return."
Hmm.
His whole demeanor
Hmm.
changed. Now that's not going to work every time, but
No,
his
but
whole demeanor changed, and he was one of the guys that I wasn't sure if it was going to work,
yeah.
because he just was so one sided, like he didn't even want to
Right.
acknowledge that I existed.
Right.
And we settled the case. We
Mm.
went back in, and Judge Malone
Yeah.
looked at me and he says, "Do we have a settlement?" I said, "Yes." And I told Judge Malone the story afterwards. And in that particular occasion, it worked. And sometimes you just have to, there's a video of this little, I think it was a little Chinese girl, and she's saying, "Mom, get things low, low." And it was a very cute little kid.
Yeah.
And it's true, though, if you can lower the volume or lower the
Yeah.
intensity a little bit,
There's
it
a,
goes a long way.
there's a talent to that. So one of the jobs I had before I got to the bench was I was the planning board chairman in the town of Iceland. So routinely we had jurisdiction over all large development projects and whatever. When I started, a gentleman, Mr. O'Connell, was the chairman before me. Wonderful old Irish gentleman
Hmm.
who had the gift, right? He would send guys packing at night, and they'd lose hundreds of thousands of dollars because perhaps their application had been denied. But he did it in such a way that they were thanking him as they walked out the door.
It's a skill.
So I learned a lot about how to handle people
Sure.
from that. I think you're right. I think people come into the courthouse, and I don't want to say they have a chip on their shoulder, but it's an intimidating process if you're not an attorney.
Sure.
So diffusing is always a good idea.
Now, you've had some high profile cases.
I have.
The Valva case is one of them. Do you find when you have a high profile case, it's a different feel, a different vibe than if you have a case where nobody knows the litigants?
Yes, obviously, because there are more sets of eyes on the case. Uh, you're correct. I wound up just being the judge who was catching, or the assigned judge for the day when Mrs. Valva's case
Luck of the draw.
came back in. Well, yes, but I also, you know what, I think that was kind of a stroke of fortunateness for me, because I think the case has progressed in a way that's fair for everybody. Um, the boys are doing well, from what I understand now, better. It's a very sad situation,
Sure.
obviously. Um, I've had a number of other. That one's still active, so I'd
Sure.
prefer not to
That's why
talk
I'm not
too much about it.
asking you too much.
There are others where I've had, everything ranging from severe sex abuse cases to one parent who unfortunately murdered the other parent. I've had a couple of those that have been in the paper, in the newspapers, in the news. They're very sad situations, because whatever happens between the adults, you have these
It's
poor
horrible.
children that are just scarred for life, basically.
I had a divorce case many years ago,
Mm.
and I get a call from, again, self-represented litigant.
Yeah.
And he said, "My wife is cheating on me." And I said, "Sir, get an attorney. I really can't help you."
Yeah.
So he ends up driving. It was Bayshore. It was in the papers. I almost had to testify at the murder trial.
Mm.
He goes comes in the back door. He gets a butcher knife. My client's mother
Mm.
was over for the night to help her because they were afraid of what this guy might do. He chased them onto the front lawn, stabbed them both,
Oh, God.
while the 8 and the 10-year-old little boys were in their
Yeah.
bedrooms. And he came in, said goodbye to them. He was full of blood. Then he called Newsday.
Hmm.
So then I got the call, obviously, and I almost had to testify at the murder trial. But the saddest thing I took out of that was the 2 little boys got shipped to Virginia to be with the family member they really didn't know.
Yeah.
Because think about it, in one fell swoop, your mom's dead,
Yeah.
your father's
Yeah.
going to jail,
Yeah.
grandma sadly got killed, and grandpa was too old to take care of them.
Yeah.
So of all the sad things that happened to the adults in this particular case, those poor kids,
Yeah.
they didn't ask for any of this.
Right. Being a family court judge is not for everybody.
Right.
If you are a little faint of heart, you shouldn't be there. I'm not saying that you need to just be an uncaring robot either, but
No.
if you're the kind of person who takes it home with you, it might not be the best place. I will just put in one quick plug, if you don't mind. I think
Sure.
right now we have an outstanding group of judges. I'm a little bit biased, but I think it's the best we've had
Yeah.
in a
I got no
long
problem
time.
with them.
And also, I will say, having practiced for 35 years before I got to where I am, and I think you'll agree with me, the court personnel in family court works very hard. Dare I say, harder than any other
They do.
courthouse. They're just amazing.
I agree with you because I used to go to Nassau, and
Mm,
I don't go anymore.
mm,
But I noticed that family court, Suffolk County Family Court,
mm-hmm,
had the most decent court officers and all that.
mm-hmm.
And of course, there's always the outliers, right?
Sure.
But I noticed that out of towners got treated in Suffolk County better than, let's say, when people went to
Right,
other places,
right,
Queens,
right.
Brooklyn or whatever, and I used to talk to some court officers that used to be in Nassau, and I said, "Why were you guys so?" It was just the culture.
Yeah.
Suffolk
Yeah.
County is different.
Our court officers are wonderful. The case I talked to you that we mentioned a little earlier, my court officer, and I don't want to give her name, had to take a 9-month-old baby from the mom at 1:45 in the morning, and she did it in such a way where it was delicate and it was caring, and it went as good as it possibly could. And those are the kind of people that work in family court, frankly.
Yeah.
Our officers are terrific. Our clerks are terrific.
I agree. Now, someone who had been on my show a few shows ago,
Mm.
it was cameras in the courtroom.
Yes.
Do you have an opinion on that?
I might be a little bit more liberal than most judges. I think transparency is a wonderful thing. In family court, it gets a little dicey, if you will, because there's a right to privacy, especially
Sure.
if I'm handling cases where we're openly discussing the sexual abuse of a child. I really can't have the courtroom open in that
I
situation.
understand.
But I will say that generally when people come into my courtroom anyway, I can't speak for the others. If we explain it rationally, they'll understand and give everybody the privacy that they need. When the Valvomatic came in initially, obviously there were a great number of people interested, and we let them, observe as much as we could.
Because there was a time, unless you were an attorney, you were not, or a litigant whose case was being called, you were not allowed in that courtroom.
Correct. Well, again, our primary concern is to protect the privacy of the children involved. But if it's a situation where that's something that's not, in danger, most of us are leaving. Well, it is open courthouse. We don't have a choice. But I don't necessarily think it's a bad thing. I think
Right.
the public trusts us more if they can see us.
More transparency.
Right.
And the James Kelly, he was the guest.
I know Mr. Kelly.
Oh,
I
you
know of him.
Right. And he was saying it's not that every case is going to be publicized.
Yeah.
You could have a camera in the courtroom where the public doesn't see that, where it's just for the people. And another good thing, think about an appeal.
Hmm.
The appellate court gets a transcript.
Hmm.
That's all they get.
Correct. Right.
Imagine if they got,
A video.
okay, see how the attorneys are doing, how the judge is doing, how
Mhm.
the litigants are reacting, how the AFC. You might get a better, like if you were on an appellate court, wouldn't
Mm.
that be something you'd want to see?
Well, I would tend to agree with you because the analogy is how many times have we all gotten text messages and misunderstood what was actually being
Right.
said?
Right. Because all you're seeing are words on a page.
Correct.
Right. And I've seen where, let's say they complain, or that attorney didn't fight, or, what's the demeanor of that particular, or was the judge being dismissive, let's say,
Right.
which you might not really capture in a transcript.
Correct. Yeah. Again, just as a basic premise, transparency is very important, should always be considered, except there are some sensitive times where you have to not
Yes. Right?
allow
They
it.
said the best disinfectant. But you're right,
That's
because you
correct.
wouldn't want a situation where a kid goes to school the next day
Hmm.
and their business is out there.
Correct.
Oh, your mother did what? Your father did what?
Right.
You don't
Right.
want that.
No.
But that doesn't mean that's what's going to happen if there's a particular camera in
Hmm.
the courtroom. There can
Hmm.
be control, just like a transcript. Transcript isn't publicized. It's given out to the people who order the transcript who are involved in the case.
Right.
So I think it's something. I think James has some good points, and that's something that maybe could be implemented over time.
Well, the court system changes slowly, right?
Yes.
I mean, it just justice grinds at times, right? I think I've had Mr. Kelly in my courtroom. I don't recall having any difficulties. He's always been polite
He's a
and a
gentleman.
gentleman.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Some judges may feel uncomfortable, or some court officers may feel uncomfortable, but
Well, before I got to the bench, I spent a great deal of my life in the public eye, so that doesn't really bother me. So,
some people,
yeah,
some people would prefer not to,
sure.
to do that. So any other suggestions? Let's say to
Just
make family better.
just sheer. It's always Phil. It's just always sheer numbers. We have. I'll give you an example. When I started, I got elected. I started in January of 17. My caseload at that point was roughly 400 or 500 dockets, and we all
Wow.
had the same, right?
Mhm.
Now we have the same number of judges, which is 9 in CI. And I can't speak for Riverhead because I've never been out there, but 9 judges still in Central Islip, and rather than 400 dockets, we have pretty much 1,000 each.
And on
So we need personnel.
a typical day, how many cases are on your calendar?
Uh,
And does it vary widely?
it varies because if I know I have a trial, I'll try to keep my
True.
cases down so that I have time to do the trial. There are weeks, the way we work it in family court in Central Islip, where you are the neglect intake person, meaning that any child neglect case that comes in during that week, you are responsible
So you got
for
to
it.
keep your
So you
calendar
got to keep
smaller.
your calendar smaller during that week. So, it'll range anywhere from, 8 or 10 to 20. But as you know, or more, I'm not talking about dockets, I'm talking about cases. Many cases have multiple dockets. There are motions, there are requests for visitation, all
Mhm.
kinds of things. So that 20 cases may sound like not much, but when there's 5 or 6 different requests on each of those cases, that 20 is now 120.
Right.
Um, so that it's always a busy day.
One of the suggestions I would have, and I always talk about
Yeah,
consequences.
sure.
So, and I said this to you earlier. Let's just say a mother is alienating the father.
Hmm.
Now, you don't necessarily rip the kid out of mom's house to go to dad, because it might not be the best thing to do in that particular case.
Right.
But the litigants that don't follow orders have to learn that there are consequences.
Correct.
So maybe they have to pay the attorney's fees of the other side, because dad has to get an attorney and
Right.
come into court
Right.
and pay someone like me, which is not a bad thing,
Mm.
pay someone like me to file a petition just so this guy can see his kid as per a stip or an order that he bargained for, whether it be in a
Sure.
divorce case.
Sure.
And mothers and fathers just sometimes think, what are they going to do to me? I've even had clients say, he's not going to take the kid away because it would be harmful to the kid. You're right. Maybe you don't do that. But maybe attorney's fees. Maybe say, is this your weekend? No, it's not my weekend. Well, you know what? Maybe you're going to be a guest of Sheriff Tulin this particular Saturday,
Mm-hmm.
right? And again, I'm not saying in many, but sometimes you got to send a message to these people that don't care because they're not afraid
Yes.
of the consequences.
Well,
There are none,
generally you start out with a soft approach and then have to progressively get harder.
right?
You're correct.
But it gets
Yeah.
there.
Yeah,
It
sometimes it does. Yes.
Right. And and I see it. But listen, we're out of time. Listen, I really, this was a great
I
discussion.
appreciate it.
We had a
Have
lot
fun.
a lot of comments. I couldn't get to all of them because we were
Okay.
just so busy talking. But thank you very much.
Well, thank
You're
you.
always welcome to come back in the future. I want to
Okay.
thank Judge Tantone for coming on the show. I want to thank my viewers for giving comments. And I guess I didn't get to read off of Mike Levitt. It says, wouldn't fresh eyes be a benefit? I guess he meant like a new judge or a new AFC if a case came in.
Sometimes,
Sometimes
yes,
that
yeah,
that that could be.
yeah.
But thank you very much for watching, and you have a great night.